All right, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar session, which is focused on PCCD's fiscal year 2023-2024 School Mental Health Grants Program. My name is Sam Cook, and I am the Director of Policy and Planning at PCCD, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kirsten Kenyon, who will be helping to co-present and facilitate today's session. Kirsten, you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone. I'm Kirsten Kenyon, and I am the Director of the Office of Research, Evaluation, and Strategic Policy Development here at PCCD. My office oversees our school safety and security unit.
Thanks, Kirsten. And our communications director, Ali Gantz, is helping to keep us honest as we navigate this platform and presentation as well. So we appreciate her assist on this front. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of housekeeping rules, the usual for webinars like these. First, a note that the webinar is being recorded. We'll post that on our website and YouTube channel as soon as it's available. And we'll also be posting a copy of the PowerPoint slides today for reference. We definitely encourage you to check out your audio settings, making sure you can hear us if you haven't already done so. Just a quick note that the Microsoft Teams live platform does not allow us to hear you directly on this platform, but please rest assured we have been looking carefully at the questions that you all submitted in your registration form, and we hope that the content we'll share today is responsive to most of the questions that folks have. Moving towards today's agenda, we will kick things off with a brief overview of our agency and then a recap of the non-competitive school mental health grants funding announcement that was recently released by PCCD. We'll talk about the application process, including some anticipated funding timelines, as well as some upcoming deadlines. And then we'll spend the remainder of our presentation focused on some of those frequently asked questions that have been asked so far. And just a reminder, you can check out questions that have already been submitted and answered using our active funding announcements page. There's a super helpful Q&A document that we'll reference a lot during today's presentation. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get started. So first, just a little bit about our agency for folks who may not be as familiar with us. The Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, or PCCD, as we're more commonly known, was established about 4.5 decades ago through Pennsylvania state law. We serve as the Commonwealth's justice policy and planning agency, and our mission is to enhance the quality, coordination, and planning within the criminal and juvenile justice systems, to facilitate the delivery of services to victims of crime, and to increase the safety of our communities. We're a relatively small but growing state agency in the executive office. We have 4 offices and are directed by an overarching commission board that includes 7 different advisory committees, 2 training boards, and of course, the School Safety and Security Committee, which is responsible for the oversight of school safety and security grant funding, including the opportunity we're talking about today, as well as other school safety related initiatives for the Commonwealth. So our responsibilities and programs are more than just grants and funding, although that might be what we're best known for. We do technical assistance, data and research, victims compensation and services, training, and a whole lot of other really fun and important things. So if you're interested in learning more about those areas, and our agency would definitely encourage you to check out our website at pccd.pa.gov. So now I'd like to turn things back over to Kirsten to walk us through this year's school mental health grants funding opportunity.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so now I'm going to provide you with an overview of our mental health grant program this year. But before we dive directly into the specifics of this funding announcement, we did want to call attention to the fact that the School Mental Health Grant Program is just one of several school safety and security related solicitations that were recently announced by our agency. These include the school district Meritorious grants, which are a non-competitive grant program that's available only to school districts. We have the school mental health grants, which is what we're talking about today. We have the competitive school safety grants, which, as the name suggests, it's a competitive grant program in which a wide variety of school entities and other applicants are eligible to submit applications for. And finally, we have the targeted school safety grants for non-public schools, which is a competitive funding announcement open for non-public schools, with intermediate units eventually making formal application on their behalf to our agency. We encourage you, if you haven't gone there already, to visit PCCD's school safety website to learn more information about these individual solicitations. You can also view or download school entity-specific one-pagers outlining eligibility criteria and basic information about each of these funding opportunities. So getting back to the focus of today's webinar session, which is the fiscal year 23-24 School Mental Health Grants Program. As we've just covered, this funding announcement is part of a broader package of school safety and security program grant funding opportunities announced by our agency just last month. The primary purpose of the School Mental Health Grants Program is to provide non-competitive grants to support mental health initiatives. As with last year's solicitation, the objective of this year's school mental health grants is to ensure eligible school entities use funding to first meet Level 1 behavioral health baseline criteria, as those criteria have been revised and adopted by the School Safety and Security Committee back in May of 2023. If your school entity already meets Level 1 baseline criteria, then you can expend funding on any other eligible mental health activities under this grant opportunity. For those of you asking yourself, what the heck are baseline criteria standards, we will get into that a little later in our presentation. Also, I want to note that for this fiscal year, a total of approximately $90 million in federal funding is available to support this program, and it supports eligible school entities and specific mental health eligible activities allowed for by law. So now you have a high-level picture of this funding opportunity. Let's get into some of the details of this funding announcement. So as I just noted, a total of $90 million in federal funds has been set aside for this grant program. We expect to fund around 778 grants under this solicitation. The amount of funding that an eligible school entity can request is based on formula criteria established in the school code. That is, school districts are eligible for a base amount of $100,000 plus an additional amount based on their 2021-22 adjusted average daily membership. Other eligible school entities can request up to $70,000 in total. You can look up the maximum award amount your school entity can request in Appendix A of the written funding announcement. Also, I want to note that grant funding can support project activities over a 2-year period, generally from January 1st, 2024 through December 31st, 2025. Per the law, only the following eligible school entities may apply for these non-competitive school mental health grants, and they are school districts, intermediate units, area career and technical schools, charter schools, regional charter schools, and cyber charter schools. If your school entity does not fall into one of these 6 eligible school entity types, you're not eligible to seek funding under this particular solicitation. But we would encourage you to check out the other funding opportunities PCCD has released related to school safety and security on our website. And now I'm going to turn things back over to Sam to cover eligible program activities.
Thanks, Kirsten. So as Kirsten mentioned, as with last year's school mental health grants, the focus this year is once again on meeting Level 1 of the revised behavioral health baseline criteria that were recently revised and adopted by our School Safety and Security Committee. So if a school entity doesn't meet all of that Level 1 criteria, they may only expend grant funds on Level 1 eligible items first. So a way to think about it perhaps is a bit like the do not pass go in Monopoly. So one change to note for purposes of grant funding use, school entities this year can use or request funds rather to address gaps that were identified as part of a recently conducted student assistance and behavioral health assessment that's conducted by an individual recognized on PCCD's School Safety and Security Assessor Registry. So this essentially means that if a school entity does not meet all of their Level 1 requirements, but does have a valid assessment done by a recognized assessor, they could utilize this grant funding to meet that gap. So just want to make sure folks were aware of that change. Last year's grant process was the first in which baseline criteria standards were statutorily tied to grant funds, and it did offer a number of lessons learned throughout that process, as you might imagine. And so our team listened to feedback that was shared by school entities during that grant process and definitely took a lot of notes. And then we worked with more than 60 stakeholders over the course of 2 months to review the originally adopted 2021 standards, identify areas where changes were needed, and then make suggested updates. So these efforts resulted in the 2023 revised baseline criteria standards that are currently in place today. You can dive in more on these new standards by checking out a webinar that we recently hosted on the topic that's available in the baseline criteria section of our school safety website. But just a couple of key changes to highlight for the group today. So first, the standards are still organized in a multi-leveled approach with language shifting just from tiers to levels. We did carefully re-examine level 1 criteria to ensure that these basic elements are foundational, that they're rooted in existing requirements for school entities, and that to the extent possible, they're as universal across school entities as possible. So we touched on this previously, but just to reiterate that these new standards recognize that the list of baseline criteria is not exhaustive and that each school entity's needs and situations are unique. So we are now allowing school entities to use grant funds to fill critical gaps that are identified in those professionally completed assessments conducted by recognized assessors. Another change is updating the criteria to more appropriately acknowledge differences across school entity types. For example, school entities with more in-person delivery versus cyber, just as one example. And then finally, recognizing the significant workforce challenges that are faced by many school entities, we did update the criteria to provide greater flexibility for school-based mental health services and supports, while still acknowledging full-time certified school employees, school mental health personnel, really as the gold standard to aim for. So because school mental health grant funding allowable uses are so closely linked to these standards, school entities are really encouraged to carefully review the revised behavioral health baseline criteria standards document and to utilize available resources, including a new interactive behavioral health baseline criteria self-assessment checklist tool that can help you kind of figure out where your school entity lands across those revised criteria. We recommend you do that prior to completing your application to make sure that you're submitting the best and most accurate information and planning uses of funds appropriately. So if you've gone through the revised behavioral health baseline criteria standards and you have all of that level 1 criteria met, you have a green light, so to speak, that allows you to look at any of the eligible activities that are identified in school code and are listed on pages 5 through 6 of the written funding announcement related to mental health, and include those in your application for funding. When you do have that green light of meeting all the level 1 criteria, school entities can then really essentially request any of those items. And again, encourage you to read pages 5 through 6 of the written funding announcement for more on these. But those would include, but aren't limited to, some of the areas that are shown on this slide. So things like counseling services and mental health personnel and services, expanding school-based mental health services, for example, telemedicine, peer support programs, technical assistance for billing for school-based services, as an example. Certainly student and staff training programs or education programs, violence prevention programs and strategies addressing concerning student behavior, conducting a student assistance program and behavioral health assessment aligned with standards adopted by the committee. So just note that's also considered a level 1 activity if you haven't completed one of those. And trauma-informed approaches, utilizing some of the standards in our model trauma-informed approach plan, things like PBIS and MTSS implementation, school-based threat assessment, and certainly working with and coordinating local and county mental health services, partnerships with nonprofits and community-based partners for serving at-risk students, and many more things. So again, recommend that you check out some of those resources to see what might spark your interest. So now that we've covered a little bit about what you can use school mental health grant funds for, let's talk about what you can't. So the funding announcement does identify a number of ineligible program activities and expenses that applicants need to be mindful of. And those include any item that's not included in the activities identified under Section 1306B, subparagraph J of the Pennsylvania Public School Code. And just any expenses and activities that were explicitly referenced on page 8 of our written funding announcement that have been deemed ineligible by the School Safety and Security Committee. And really important, especially for this grant program, and as noted on this slide, the eligibility of items or activities that you can seek funding for really does also depend on whether your school entity has fully met level 1 baseline criteria standards for behavioral health. And even if you have met that level 1 criteria, just please remember that school entities are limited to selecting appropriate eligible activities designated in statute and in the funding announcement. A couple other things to just keep in the back pocket. PCCD may randomly audit and monitor grant recipients just to ensure the appropriate use of grant funds and compliance with provisions of the grant program, which does include satisfying level 1 baseline criteria. And again, we would strongly encourage you to carefully review that written funding announcement document just to be sure that your application and budget align with these funding guidelines. So in addition to carefully reviewing that funding announcement document for allowable and unallowable uses of funds, we also encourage applicants to bear in mind a couple other financial considerations associated with this non-competitive funding announcement. So the first is to check out the language and carefully review the competitive bidding and sole source procurement section of the written funding announcement, which can be found on page 11. That section includes important procurement related information and requirements that's going to be important for your project moving forward. Just a note that PCCD does have approval of all final budgets. And in addition, grant funds must be used to supplement, not supplant or replace existing spending on school mental health initiatives and programs within a school entity. So speaking of supplementation, this is definitely an area that PCCD receives a lot of questions about from applicants, and it was certainly a popular topic that came up in the questions that were submitted for today's webinar. So what is supplementation? First, let's talk about what it is not. So in general, we would not consider the following to be supplementation. That would include requesting funds for the same purpose as a previous PCCD school safety grant. We would not consider supplementation to be requesting items or personnel that are currently funded but not included or reoccurring in your school entity's budget. For example, staff or items that were paid for with other grant funds, as an example. Requesting additional funding to increase the hours for current personnel. So for example, going from part-time to full-time or increasing the number of contracted hours available, or to just increase program activity or capacity overall. So what we would generally consider to be supplementation, those are listed on the right-hand side of your screen, and that would include requesting grant money for activities, personnel, or items that are currently included in your school entity's annual budget, or using funds to retroactively support expenses that you've already purchased or procured. So as an example, that could include grant funding requested to pay ongoing expenses as part of a previously executed contract or purchase order. So we certainly recognize and know that school entities are juggling a lot of different funding sources, including a lot from PCCD, and that this can sometimes be an area that's really tricky to navigate. So if you do have any questions about whether something is or is not supplementation, we definitely encourage you to connect with your assigned fiscal staff and get additional situation-specific clarification. So in addition to those financial considerations, there are a couple of other things that we wanted applicants to keep in mind for this funding announcement. So first, Act 33 amended the PA Public School Code to establish new requirements related to Section 1319-B, which is the section on annual school safety incident data reporting to the Department of Education, as well as the establishment of memoranda of understanding with local law enforcement by school entities. So under these new amendments through Act 33, any school entity that does not comply with those annual reporting and MOU provisions may not be awarded any grant administered by PCCD's School Safety and Security Committee. So that would include school safety grants like the School Mental Health Grants Program. So we won't be able to award anything for a school entity that's not in compliance until the school entity has come into compliance with those requirements. In addition, PCCD staff do have the authority pursuant to state law to randomly audit and monitor grant recipients to ensure the appropriate use of grant funds and compliance with provisions of the grant program. And that does include verifying and satisfying level 1 baseline criteria. So just a note that school entities that do falsify information in their application may be subject to returning grant funding or other penalties allowed for by law. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Kirsten to talk us through a little bit of navigating the application process.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so eligible school entities must submit their school mental health grant application using PCCD's e-grant system in order to receive funding. Applications must be submitted electronically in our system by 11:59 p.m. on February 29th, 2024. The e-grants application first asks for an executive summary, which includes a very short script asking you to supply how much you're applying for and what you will be expending the funds on. Please be sure to follow the script. And again, it doesn't have to be super long or in-depth because we use it to help inform the committee as to what it is that you're coming in for. We also have a section for program activities, which will include the list of eligible mental health only program activities allowed for under this solicitation. You'll be asked to select the category or categories that best correspond with what you're seeking funding for. I would note that if you're looking for funding to support physical security enhancements, school districts may want to consider using their Meritorious grant opportunity or the competitive grant opportunities that are also open at this time. All other school entities that are on this call should consider the competitive solicitations as well for physical security needs. This is straight up just for mental health funding. The mental health solicitation also includes questions about whether or not you meet level 1 baseline criteria for behavioral health. As Sam has outlined, that is a major component of the solicitation and the law. We've simplified this section this year to ask you directly if you self-certify if you meet all of level 1. If you do, that's great. Check that box. And if you do not, that's okay, that's fine. Just please answer the additional questions regarding each criterion and provide information about the status of meeting that criterion. The more detail you provide in this section, the better, as we purposely drafted this section to try to minimize the need to go back and forth with you if we don't understand something. That was something that added a lot to the process last year and the processing time, having to go back and forth with over 700 some applicants. We also have a section asking if you've had a behavioral health assessment completed of your school entity or a building that's most representative of your school as a whole. For the purposes of this solicitation, as Sam has noted earlier, if you've had an assessment done by someone on our registry to conduct such an assessment, it enables you to request funding for items or activities that they've identified as needed by your school entity. And finally, the budget details section will ask you to provide line item information about personnel, benefits, consultants, training and travel, equipment and supplies, construction, and another category. Provide some information about your request. The more detailed you are in this section, the better off you usually are, as our fiscal folks will return budget requests that are not completed correctly. As ever, applicants are strongly encouraged to carefully read and review the written funding announcement document prior to starting their application in PCCD's eGrant system. As I've noted before in other webinars, eGrants has a timeout feature on it. So that means if you don't utilize the page that you're on within 20 minutes, it times you out of the system. And unfortunately, it does not automatically save your work. It's much easier to prep all of your materials in advance prior to entering it into our eGrants system. If after reading the funding announcement, you still have questions about the announcement and/or any other general questions, first, we recommend checking the current list of questions and answers, which is located under the active funding announcements webpage on our website, which it is a running document that's updated routinely on our website with questions that folks such as yourself have sent in and our responses. We also have a link to that webpage on our handy one-pager documents too that I mentioned earlier. The Q&As are updated on a routine basis, and it's possible that someone has already asked your question and the answer is already there. But if you don't see a Q&A that corresponds to your question, please email our resource account, ra-cd-sssc@pa.gov, and put the title of the funding announcement in the subject line, and we'll be sure to get back to you. So now I'm going to turn things back over to Sam so she can run through some of the most common frequently asked questions we've already gotten in relation to this solicitation.
Thanks, Kirsten. All right, so one of the questions that we receive from applicants and today's participants is whether or not the school mental health grants program is funded with state or federal dollars. So as Kirsten mentioned earlier, this is federal funding. It's actually federal COVID relief ARPA school mental health grant funding. The topic of grant funding and connections to revised behavioral health baseline criteria was also a popular line of questions, and hopefully ones that we addressed pretty thoroughly earlier in the webinar. But just to be triply clear, some folks were asking whether all level 1 standards need to be met before school entities can use funds for other activities. So as we've covered previously, the answer to that is yes. School entities will need to have met all level 1 baseline criteria for behavioral health and school climate before they can use funds for other more advanced eligible activities. If you have plans to meet those level 1 gaps in other ways, please use the fields that Kirsten mentioned to provide that information in your application. Once that level 1 is met, you can use funding for any other eligible mental health related project activity. And again, we do encourage you, if you've had a recently conducted assessment that has something else flagged that's not on that criteria that you want to use funds for, please provide that information in your application, since that's a new feature this year. We've also gotten some questions on whether grant funds can support contracted behavioral health services. So the answer to this question is yes. So in addition, funds could also be used to support costs associated with training and compensation of school-based mental health staff. Think school counselors, social workers, school psychologists, school nurses, etc. So we've also gotten a lot of questions related to supplantation, as we covered earlier. So that includes whether grant funds could support people or programs who are already funded or budgeted through previous grants that are ending. As an example, mental health personnel or services that are in either a PCCD grant or a different funding source that might be going away in the near future. So the answer to that question is that yes, generally speaking, we don't consider requesting school mental health grant funds for the same purpose in a previous PCCD school safety grant or another funding source that's ending to be supplementation. So you can feel free to budget for those if you need to. And finally, some participants did seek clarification as to whether physical security costs, such as school security personnel, security equipment, etc., could be covered using school mental health grants funding. So as Kirsten alluded to earlier, the focus of this grant program, as the name really suggests, is primarily on enhancing school mental health services, programs, and supports, not so much on physical security. So we definitely encourage applicants to carefully review the eligible activities and the requirements that are articulated in the written funding announcement. And we also encourage you to check out those other funding announcements that are currently open that Kirsten mentioned, to just determine if those would be a better fit for specific activities. Those one-pagers are a really great starting point. So you can click on your school entity type, and then it provides a summary of all of the grant opportunities that you're eligible for and some direct links to where you can find more information. We do want to note that PCCD staff will be cross-checking applications that are submitted as part of the 2023 school safety grants funding package. So we do encourage school entities to really carefully consider which funding opportunities might be most appropriate for particular items and programs and activities. And at a minimum, we just ask that school entities ensure that you're not submitting duplicative funding requests. Again, those one-pagers are a super helpful starting point for those planning purposes. So with all of that, we know there's many, many more questions that have been asked and answered. Again, encourage you to check out those written question and answer documents. For more information, we'll continue to update those through the end of this month. We want to thank you for your participation in today's webinar session. We hope you found it helpful. We certainly appreciate your time and your interest. As a reminder, we will be making a recording of this webinar available on our website and YouTube channel, along with a copy of PowerPoint slides from today's presentation. Check out that funding announcement. Take a little bit of time to make sure you carefully read through that, along with the other related materials like baseline criteria documents that we referenced today on our website. And again, if you have any lingering questions, please don't hesitate to contact our staff using that resource account email address that's referenced earlier by Kirsten, and that's available in our solicitation document. So again, we thank you. Thanks for the work you do. Thanks for taking some time today to be with us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day, and good luck on the applications. Thanks.